Chapter 6. St. Joseph's Cure. I emerged from that 4-day fit in a state of such unbearable torment that only the Lord can know the truth of what I went through. I had bitten my tongue to pieces. Not a morsel of food had passed my lips in so long that I was too weak to swallow, and I choked when I tried to take even a sip of water. It felt like all my limbs were out of joint and my mind was in a total fog. Not only that, but the suffering I had endured during those 4 days left me all twisted up like a pile of knotted ropes. I had no more ability to move my hand or foot than a dead person has, unless someone else moved it for me. Actually, I think I was able to move one finger on my right hand. I was in such a pitiful state that I could not bear for anyone to see me like that. I felt so bruised that my friends and family had to carry me around on a sheet. One person would take up one corner and another person would take up the other. This went on until Easter. Since I couldn't bear to be touched, the only time I had any relief was when I was left alone for a little while. After resting in solitude, I began to think that I was getting well. I was very relieved whenever my pain let up, simply because I was beginning to worry that my patience was failing me. I still suffered from terrible bouts of fever and chills and unrelenting nausea. I was desperate to return to the Incarnation, so my family finally relented and took me there. The nuns, who had been expecting to receive a dead body, were pleased to be welcoming a living woman instead. But I was in such bad shape that I looked worse than a dead person. I was nothing but skin and bones by this time, and I cannot even begin to describe how weak I was. It took 8 months for me to recover from this paralysis and the illness that accompanied it. Although I continued to improve, the paralysis lingered for almost 3 years. When I began to get around by crawling on my hands and knees, I praised God. I accepted all this and eventually came to bear my condition with genuine joy. After all, it was a vast improvement over what I went through at first. I had surrendered to the will of God, even if He were to leave me like that forever. I think my greatest wish was that I could get better just so that I could practice solitary prayer again as I had been taught. It was impossible to be alone in the convent infirmary. I was unwavering in my commitment to confession. I spoke about God constantly and in such a way that everyone I talked to was uplifted and amazed by the patience the Lord had given me. It was obvious that this was a gift from the Beloved's hand, because without it, I could not possibly have endured such terrible suffering with such pure contentment. In prayer, God granted me the grace of His mercy. This was a wonderful blessing because it helped me to realize what it is to love Him. I began to feel the holy virtues flowing back into me, although as it turned out, not strongly enough to hold me up in righteousness. I made it my practice to avoid speaking badly of anyone, ever. Whenever I was tempted, I would simply remind myself not to say anything about someone else that I would not want someone to say about me. I was uncompromising in my commitment to this value. Of course I was not perfect, and certain difficult situations came up that strained my resolve to the breaking point. Still, this was my customary way of behaving, and those who spent time with me were so struck by it that they made it their practice to. People realized that when they were with me, they could turn their backs and be perfectly safe. This was true not only for the women I lived with at the Incarnation, but also for my friends, my relatives, and my students. But I have set a very bad example in other areas, and I'm going to have to be accountable to God for those. Please forgive me, Your Majesty, for all the trouble I have caused. Know that my negative actions do not in any way reflect my positive intentions. My longing for solitude continued. I still loved to read good books. The only conversation I found worthwhile was conversation about God. Whenever I encountered anyone who wanted to talk about God with me, it gave me more delight and sheer recreation than any worldly pleasures, which are actually empty, ever could. I took communion and made confession as often as possible. I remember that sometimes I avoided prayer because I was afraid of facing my disloyalty to God and the terrible pain this would cause me. The very thought that I might have done anything to offend my beloved was a severe punishment in itself. This anxiety intensified to such a degree that I do not know what to compare it to. It was not a matter of fear, because I was just as likely to suffer from this kind of distress when I considered the blessings the Lord had given me in prayer, as when I reflected on the mistakes I had made. If I thought about all He had done for me, I couldn't help but notice how little I had offered in return. I couldn't bear to face this, and I would cry over my many faults. But my tears only made me angry with myself. Had my remorse stopped me from falling whenever an opportunity presented itself? Were all my resolutions and effort doing me any good? This weeping of mine struck me as fraudulent. All it did was highlight my imperfection, because tears of repentance are a gift from God, and I was wasting them. I always tried to confess my transgressions as soon as I committed them, and I did everything I could to return to a state of grace. But the problem was that I did not know how to cut off my sinful inclinations at their root. Nor were my confessors much help in the matter. If they had told me that these long religious conversations of mine were thinly veiled indulgences, I would have stopped them immediately. I would never have consciously risked missing the mark for even a single day. In prayer, I would be overcome with awe of God. A sign that I was motivated more by love than by fear was that I never thought about retribution. My anxiety was always enfolded by love. The whole time I was sick, I was hypervigilant over my conscience, careful to avoid anything resembling spiritual error. Dear God, how I yearned for good health so that I might serve you better. This desire itself became the cause of my undoing. I was so young when I became seriously paralyzed. As soon as I realized that earthly doctors were unable to cure me, I turned to heaven for healing. Because even though I carried my illness with joy, I still preferred to get better. I sometimes thought that if I were to recover my health only to go out and miss the mark all over again, it would be better to stay sick. But I still believed that I could be of greater service to my God if I were well. This is how we deceive ourselves. We do not surrender entirely to God's will, even though He is the one who knows what is best for us. I began to offer devotions during Mass. I stuck to prescribed prayers because I distrusted alternative expressions of worship. Women, especially, love to invent ceremonies. I could never stand these rituals. It has been confirmed to me since then that such practices are superstitious and inappropriate. I chose the glorious Saint Joseph as my master and advocate and entrusted myself to him completely. I found that this great Father and Lord of mine solved the problem of my health and also delivered me from bigger issues, like the loss of my soul and my honor. He freely gave me greater blessings than I could ever ask of him. Even now, I can't think of a single instance in which he has neglected to give me anything I have asked for. It is amazing to see all the mercy God has shown me and the perils, both physical and spiritual, from which he has rescued me through this blessed saint. The Lord seems to have given other saints the grace to fulfill certain needs, but in my experience, this glorious saint comes to our aid in all areas. When Christ walked this earth, Joseph was his guardian. As a boy, Jesus called him Father and obeyed his commands. It seems to me that Christ wants to know that in heaven he still does everything Joseph asks. Other people I have advised have experienced a similar response when they commended themselves to this saint. I used to observe St. Joseph's feast with great ceremony. I was obsessed with the details. Although my intentions were good, I can see now that I celebrated this holy day with more vanity than spirituality. Another negative trait of mine was that whenever the Lord gave me the grace to do anything well, I would do it imperfectly instead, replete with mistakes. I was highly skilled at being finicky and vain. May the Lord forgive me. I wish I could convince everyone to be devoted to this glorious saint. I have experienced the innumerable blessings that come through him from God. I have never known anyone who sincerely revered him and offered particular vows to him who did not make spiritual progress. Saint Joseph comes to the aid of those who commend themselves to him. Year after year I have made some request of him on his feast day, and he has always granted it. If my appeal were twisted in any way, he would straighten it out for me. If I were a person with authority to do so, I would not hesitate to describe in great detail the many favors this magnificent saint has given to me and to others. But since I am constrained by my order to write about certain things at great length and to minimize others, I will have to keep this part much more brief than I would like. In other words, I'm going to have to act like someone who has no sense of discrimination and doesn't know what is good. For the love of God, I ask anyone who does not believe me to put my claims about St. Joseph to the test. Then you'll see for yourself the great goodness that comes when you offer devotion to this sublime patriarch. How could anyone think about the Queen of Angels and how she suffered for the child Jesus and not give thanks to St. Joseph for the way he helped them both? People of prayer should foster special affection for him. If you cannot find a guide to teach you contemplative practice, appeal to St. Joseph, and I assure you that this wondrous master will not lead you astray. I pray that I have not made a mistake in daring to speak of St. Joseph like this. While I have always made a great display of my devotion to him, I have never managed to successfully imitate and serve him. He cured me of my paralysis and gave me the power to stand up and walk again because of who he is. I, on the other hand, have misused this gift because of who I am. Who could have predicted that I would fall so soon after receiving so many gifts from God? After His Majesty blessed me with the very virtues that awakened my desire to serve him. After I had found myself almost dead and in grave spiritual danger. After he had raised me up, body and soul, filling everyone with amazement that I had survived. What is this, my Lord? We live a perilous life. Here I am writing this account, and through your grace and mercy I could easily join St. Paul in saying, though I would not say it half as well, for it is not I now who live, but you, my Creator, who lives in me. It has been quite a few years now that, as far as I can understand, you have held me by the hand. In every way, little and big, I have always wanted to place your will before mine, and I have repeatedly resolved to do so. Over the years you have tested these desires and resolutions of mine. Without even being aware of it, Your Majesty, I must have disappointed you again and again. There is nothing I would not do for love of you. In fact, you have already helped me to accomplish many things. I don't desire this world or worldly things. Nothing seems to make me happy unless it comes from you. Everything else feels like a heavy cross. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't really want what I say I want. But you know, my beloved, that I am not lying. I'm afraid, with good reason, that you may give up on me again. I am well aware how totally dependent I am on your grace to compensate for my lack of strength and virtue, and to help me not give up on you. Please, don't abandon me, my beloved. Not now, while I am thinking all these things about myself. I really don't know what makes us want to keep living when life is so uncertain. I used to think, my Lord, that it would be impossible for me to forsake you. And look how many times I have done so. I can't help but be afraid, because when you withdrew from me, even just a little, I fell flat on my face. May you be forever blessed. Even though I have neglected you, you have continuously offered me your hand and helped me back up. Often, my Lord, I refused that hand of yours. Often, my Lord, You would call me again, and again I would refuse. This is what I would like to talk about next. Chapter 7. Prisoner of the Parlor. This is when I began to indulge in distraction after distraction, conceit on top of conceit, vice compounded by vice. I gave in to so many subtle and destructive temptations during this time, and my soul drifted so far away on the tides of vanity that I was afraid to approach God again. Prayer is an intimate friendship with the divine, and I did not feel worthy of such intimacy. My shame grew in proportion to the abundance of my errors. The more I transgressed, the less comfort and joy I was able to derive from holy things. It was clear to me, my beloved, that my joy was failing me because I was failing you. The spirit of evil, disguised as humility, led me into the most insidious deception of all: fear of prayer. I felt utterly lost. I considered myself to be the most wicked person alive. I concluded that I would be better off giving up on silent contemplation and starting to pray like everybody else. It was time to stop conversing privately with God and instead recite the vocal prayers exactly as I had learned them. After all, any outward display of silent prayer only deceived others into thinking I was good and holy, when in fact I was the opposite. My decline in virtue had nothing to do with the house where I lived. It was not their fault. I managed to manipulate everyone's good opinion of me, but I didn't mean to. I would never dream of pretending to be a good Christian. I have had many faults, but I have never, praise God, been an egomaniac or a hypocrite as far as I know. The minute I ever felt the stirrings of arrogance inside myself, it would make me so upset that the devil would flee in consternation and I would be left better off. Maybe if God had chosen to tempt me in this area as severely as he has in others, I would have developed an overly inflated concept of my own holiness. But he has kept me from falling into this trap. May he be forever blessed. The truth is, I was much more troubled by the notion that people would be fooled by my outward appearance of goodness than that they would see me for who I knew myself to be inside. There were several reasons why nobody noticed how bad I was. What they observed was that even though I was very young and vulnerable to countless opportunities for missing the mark, I frequently removed myself from the group to pray in solitude. I read a lot and spoke exclusively about God. I liked to have pictures of Christ everywhere, and I requested a chapel of my own that I could fill with sacred objects. I refused to ever speak badly about another person. I did many other things that made me appear to be virtuous. The truth was, I was vain and worldly. I liked it when people held me in high esteem. Because of my spiritual conduct, they gave me as much freedom as they gave to the older nuns, even more. They had a great deal of confidence in me because I never took liberties. I asked permission for everything. I did not sneak out at night to talk to outsiders through crevices in the wall or to hold private discussions with other nuns. I don't think I could ever have brought myself to participate in such secret exchanges, nor did I try, because the Lord held me by the hand. I try to consider the ramifications of things. It seemed to me that it would be wrong for me to do anything that would compromise anyone's reputation by engaging in clandestine encounters. After all, they were the ones who were good and I was the bad one. As if any of those other things I was doing were so virtuous. The truth is, though I often acted inappropriately in different areas, it was never as intentional as that kind of misbehavior would have been. It was probably inappropriate for me to live in a convent that was not cloistered. The lives of those who have not taken a vow of enclosure are less circumscribed than those of cloistered nuns. Most women are good, and enjoying more freedom would not make them any less good. But I am bad, And the only reason this latitude did not lead me straight to hell was that the Lord used his own special ways and remedies to save me from peril. It seems to me that the more autonomy people are given in spiritual community, the greater their risk of missing the mark. For those who are inclined to be wicked, broad liberty is not an antidote for their weakness, but rather a further step on the path to hell. This is not the case in the convent where I live now. There are many women here who serve the Lord in a completely genuine manner. His Majesty cannot fail to help them on their way. Ours is not one of those open convents either. We practice rigorous spiritual discipline here. I'm talking about other religious houses I have been familiar with. This kind of thing breaks my heart. When a spiritual community engages in the activities of the world, the residents tend to forget their religious obligations. Then the Lord has to call to each of them in a particular way, not once, but over and over, until each remembers why she is there. May God save them and not let them confuse virtue with sin, as I have done so many times. This is not an easy thing for people to see. The Lord has to take the matter into his own hands. If parents would heed my advice, they would think twice about sending their daughters to a convent, assuming the girls will automatically walk in the way of God, when in fact they are likely to get into more trouble than they would out in the world. They should at least look out for their daughters' reputations. Parents would be better off letting their children marry someone of a lower status than they would be sending them to convents of this kind. If the young women are genuinely inclined toward devotion, then may God lead them away from what is dangerous and toward all that is good. Otherwise, they might as well stay home. If they want to be wicked there, they cannot hide it for long. In a monastic setting, such behaviors can be concealed for a very long time until, eventually, the Lord himself reveals them. These girls not only hurt themselves, but their actions have a negative effect on others. Often, though, it's not their fault. The poor creatures are simply trying to fit in. Some girls join a spiritual community hoping to escape this cycle. They think that by withdrawing from the world they will avoid worldly pitfalls and so be able to serve God undistracted. But the next thing they know, they find themselves in 10 worlds combined and they don't have any idea how to get out and remedy the situation. Youth, sensuality, and the spirit of evil conspire to incline these young women toward worldly attachments and to convince them that these things are somehow acceptable. They remind me of those poor atheists who blind themselves to the sacred and then try to convince everyone else that the path they are following is the correct one. But all along, a voice deep inside them is whispering the truth. Oh, what terrible harm! What terrible harm comes to religious people who do not live what they profess! I am speaking now as much of men as of women. There are 2 paths available to those who enter religious life: the way of virtue and devotion, and the opposite of virtue and devotion. Unfortunately, both paths seem to be trodden equally. No, I'm wrong. They are not trodden equally. Many more people walk the irreligious path because it is the broader road and much easier to navigate for those of us inclined to miss the mark. The true spiritual life is so rare that those who hear the call and begin to follow it ought to be more afraid of the members of their own community than of all the demonic forces that exist. They should carefully conceal their true desire for friendship with God. It is safer to discuss the false connections that the spirit of evil stirs up in religious houses. I don't know why we're so shocked to hear about all the bad things that happened in spiritual communities. After all, those who are supposed to be modeling virtue to the rest of us have generally drifted so far away from the ancient wisdom that the spirits of the saints have abandoned us. May His Divine Majesty be pleased to remedy the situation as He sees fit. And so I was misled into thinking that it was harmless for me to indulge in the pseudo-spiritual conversations I enjoyed so much. It was only later that I discovered that this kind of companionship could be dangerously distracting. I didn't see why such an ordinary custom as receiving visitors at the convent and discussing so-called religious things with them should do my soul any more harm than it did other nuns who were perfectly decent people. I failed to consider that they were better people than I was, and what was safe for them was not safe for me. Still, I have no doubt that there is an element of trouble for everyone in this practice, because even if it does not cause damage, it is at least a waste of time. Once, in the early stages of my acquaintance with someone, the Lord chose to show me that these kinds of relationships were not good for me. He broke through the core of my thick blindness to teach me and show me the way. Christ himself appeared before me, fierce and direct, to tell me exactly what it was that troubled him about these interactions. I saw him more clearly through the eyes of my soul than I ever could have with my physical eyes. This vision had such a powerful impact on me that even now, 26 years later, I can still seem to see him standing here. I was so stunned and disturbed by this experience that I never again wanted to see the person who triggered it. It did me no good to maintain the belief that it was impossible to see with any eyes other than those of the body. It was the spirit of evil that made me think such a thing. It made me wonder if my vision of Christ was a figment of my imagination, or, worse, a demonic phenomenon. But I couldn't shake the conviction that this vision came from God, and I had not imagined it. Since the stern form in which Christ had appeared was not pleasing to me, however, I forced myself to lie to myself, and I didn't dare discuss the matter with anyone. The spirit of evil returned full force, convincing me that there was no harm in my relationship with that person, and that far from damaging my reputation, our interactions could only enhance it. So I started having these intimate spiritual conversations with him again, and later I received other visitors in the same way. I wasted years in this insidious diversion. When I was doing it, it never seemed to me to be as bad as it really was, although I sometimes had a clear sense that I was doing something wrong. Still, no one ever distracted me quite as badly as the person I've been speaking about. I was excessively fond of him. There was another time when I was with the same person, and we saw something like a large toad coming toward us, but moving much more swiftly than toads generally do. Other people who were there saw it too. I could not imagine where such a creature could have been hiding and how it could have emerged like that in broad daylight. None of us had ever seen anything like it before. This incident had such a powerful effect on me that it must have concealed a deeper meaning. I have never forgotten this experience either. Oh, great God, you warned me in so many little ways and with such tender compassion. And how much did I benefit from your efforts? Hardly at all. There was an older nun in the house where I lived, a distant relative of mine who had been there a long time, whose spiritual practice was extremely disciplined. "These parlor discourses of yours are not healthy," she would warn me sometimes. Not only did I refuse to listen to her, but I became annoyed that she was making something innocent into some kind of scandal. I mention all this to demonstrate how bad I was and how great God is, since I fully deserved to be punished for my outrageous ingratitude. This way, if it is God's will and pleasure that anyone read this book, they can take it as a warning and not have to make the same mistakes I made. I beg you, for the love of the Lord, don't get caught up in this noxious kind of recreation. May His Majesty be pleased to allow me to make up here for the many people I have led astray in the past. In the midst of danger, I would assure them that there was nothing wrong. Of course, I would never willingly deceive anyone. My faulty guidance was nothing but an artifact of my own blindness. Without ever dreaming that I was doing so, I was setting a terrible example and causing a great deal of harm. It is a very common temptation among beginners to try to help other people before they have learned how to take care of themselves. In those early days when I was still very sick, I fell into that trap. Luckily, the outcome was positive. Because I loved my father so much, I wanted him to benefit from the blessings that I was enjoying from the practice of prayer. There seemed to me no greater gift to share. So I did my best, by indirect means, to persuade him to pray. I gave him books on the subject. As I've said, my father was a very good man, and this practice captured his heart. Within a few short years, he had made so much progress that all I could do was praise God for it. I was very much encouraged by this. It's not that my father did not suffer great trials along his path, but he handled them with tremendous patience and perseverance. He visited me often because it comforted him to discuss divine things. Meanwhile, I was becoming more and more of a wreck. I was no longer praying. I couldn't bear to see that my father still thought I was practicing what I preached. I had somehow convinced myself that refraining from prayer was more truly humble than praying. This became a serious temptation for me and almost caused my ruin. At least when I was practicing prayer, I might offend God one day, but the next day I had the opportunity to recollect myself and turn away from other occasions for missing the mark. A year had passed since I last prayed, and I finally decided it was time to tell my father the truth about my own practice. When that blessed man came to visit me, it broke my heart to see him laboring under the illusion that I was communing with God as I had before. I admitted that I was not practicing prayer anymore, but I did not tell him the real reason why. I used my ill health as an excuse. Although I had recovered from the worst of my ailments, I have suffered from various maladies, some quite serious, ever since. Lately, my problems have not been quite as severe, but they still bother me. For instance, I have suffered from nausea and vomiting every morning for 20 years. I cannot eat a thing until afternoon, sometimes even later. Ever since I began taking communion more regularly, I have had to make myself throw up at night before I go to sleep, using feathers or some other trigger, which is terribly uncomfortable. But if I let the nausea go on, I feel even worse. Nor am I ever entirely free from aches and pains, especially in my heart. Sometimes they're quite intense. The fainting spells, which used to be continuous, are now more rare. And it's been 8 years since I was cured of that mysterious paralysis and the high fevers that accompanied it. These illnesses seem so insignificant to me now that I've begun to rejoice in them, thinking that maybe they have served my beloved in some way. Since my father never lied himself, he believed me when I told him that I had quit practicing prayer because of my health. By this time, in light of the nature of the things we discussed, I shouldn't have been lying either. I knew quite well that there is no excuse for giving up prayer. But to make my story more convincing, I added that it was all I could do to keep up with my regular religious duties. Not that one needs much physical strength for a practice that demands nothing more than showing up with a loving and constant heart. Our Lord always provides opportunities for prayer if we choose to take them. I say always because even though sickness and other troubles may sometimes hinder our free access to hours of solitude, there are plenty of other times when we are healthy and can make up for that. We can also pray in the midst of our ordinary activities, and we can even harness our pain itself as a genuine opportunity for prayer by offering up the very thing from which we are suffering and remembering the one for whom we suffer it. All we need to do is accept our ill health and the 1,000 other things that happen to us. Prayer is an exercise of love. It is a mistake to believe that if we have no time alone, we cannot practice prayer, or, for that matter, that when we do have time alone, we will use it to pray. With a little care, we can draw great blessings from the occasions when the Beloved sends us trials that deprive us of time we had set aside for prayer. When my conscience was clear, I had no trouble uncovering these blessings. Because my father loved and respected me, he believed everything I said. In fact, he felt sorry for me. But he had reached such a high state of prayer that he began to spend less and less time visiting me. He would leave shortly after arriving. He felt that to linger was a waste of time. Since I was busy wasting time on various vanities, I did not take this very seriously. My father was not the only person I tried to lead into a life of contemplative prayer, even though I myself was more interested in trivial matters. When I noticed certain nuns reciting vocal prayers, I taught them how to practice silent prayer. I would help them along and share my books with them. As I have mentioned, ever since I first began to pray, I have had this desire for others to serve God. It seemed to me that since I was no longer serving my beloved as I knew I should, the least I could do was to not waste the knowledge His Majesty had given me and help others to serve Him through me. Look how blind I was. I was trying to save others while letting myself get completely lost. Around this time, my father became very ill and eventually died. I went home to take care of him. Vanity had rendered my soul sicker than disease had rendered my father's body. However, I must say that during the entire period when I was wasting time showing off in the convent parlor, I never, to my knowledge, committed any grave error. If I had believed I was in any way offending God, I would have stopped immediately. My father's illness was deeply distressing to me. I hope that I repaid him a small part of all he did for me when I was sick. In spite of my grief, I forced myself to stay busy. Even though in losing him I was losing all the goodness and comfort in my life, I was determined not to let my anguish show. And so I behaved as if I didn't have a care in the world, until the day he died. I loved that man so much that as I saw his death approaching, I felt like my own soul was being ripped from my body. I cannot help but praise the Lord for the good death my father died. He welcomed death. After receiving extreme unction, he offered us final words of wisdom. "Please, my children, pray for God to have mercy on my soul," he said. "And serve God always. All things come to an end," he reminded us. Then he began to weep. "I would have liked to have been a friar," he said. "I regret not having served God in that way." I see now that God gave my father a glimpse of his impending death a full 2 weeks before he died. Until that time, while he was certainly not feeling well, I don't think he believed that he was dying. But afterward, even though he felt much better and his doctors assured him that he was going to be fine, he ignored them and got to work putting his soul in order. My father's primary affliction was a severe and unrelenting pain in his spine. Sometimes it was so acute it was like torture. Since the image of Christ carrying the cross on his back was so meaningful to my father, I suggested to him that maybe His Majesty wanted him to share some of the pain that Jesus endured. He took such comfort in this notion that I never heard him complain again. For the last 3 days of his life, my father was mostly unconscious. But on the last day, the Lord brought him to full consciousness. We were amazed. We began to recite the creed aloud with him. He remained alert until halfway through, and then he just quietly slipped away. There he lay, looking like an angel. It seems to me that my father had a truly angelic character and soul. I'm not sure why I've told you all this, except that maybe I still feel guilty. With the legacy of goodness my father left, in terms of the quality of both his life and his death, I should have made more of an effort to improve myself. There is no doubt that your father went directly to heaven, the highly educated Dominican father Vicente Barron said. He had been my father's confessor for many years, and he praised the purity of my father's conscience. Father Barron was a very good man, a man in awe of God. I went to him for confession, and he was a real help to me. He took great care to point out to me the dangerous spiritual waters I was heading for and set my soul back on track. He had me meet with him every 2 weeks, and gradually I began to open up to him and tell him about my path of prayer. "Never give up this practice, because it can do you nothing but good," he told me. So I began to engage in prayer again, and I have never ceased. This did not stop me, however, from continuing to miss the mark. My life felt very heavy to me because prayer illumined all my faults. God was calling to me in one ear, and the world beckoned in the other. All the things of God filled me with joy, but the things of the world held me captive. It seems to me now that I was struggling to reconcile two fundamental opposites, the life of the spirit and the pleasures and distractions of the senses. It was very difficult for me to practice prayer, because my spirit was not the master but the slave. I was not able to shut myself inside myself, which was my whole method of prayer, without shutting 1,000 follies in with me. I spent many years engaged in this struggle. Looking back, I'm amazed at how I could have put up with this and never given up one mode in favor of the other. Well, what I do know is that by this time, there was no turning back. The power to abandon prayer was no longer in my hands, because he who desired me and wished to bless me with great mercies was holding me in his. Oh, God, help me. If only I could recount all the times you rescued me from myself over the years and how I kept going right back into opportunities for error. If only I could describe how you preserved my reputation when I was in danger of completely ruining it. Through my actions, I continued to demonstrate what kind of person I really was. But the Lord kept covering up my faults and uncovering some small virtues, as if I had any, and magnifying it in the eyes of others, causing them to hold me in high esteem. Even though my mischief was sometimes blatantly obvious, nobody took it seriously. They focused on the good things instead. This is because the knower of all things saw that later, when I would speak about serving him, I would require some credibility. And in his supreme generosity, my beloved chose not to look upon my sins, but instead on my constant desire to serve him and the sorrow I suffered in lacking the strength to manifest it. O Lord of my soul, how could I ever pay tribute to the mercy you bestowed on me during those years? How could I ever express my gratitude for the moments when I turned against you and you swiftly brought me back through the most extraordinary repentance to taste your sublime gifts? Truly, my King, you chose the most delicate and painful punishment I could possibly have endured. You knew exactly what would break my heart open. You chastised my faults with great favors. I do not believe I am speaking nonsense here. Although when I recall how ungrateful I was in those days, I almost wish that I could lose my mind and not have to reflect on how wicked I was. In my condition, it was far more painful to receive divine favors when I had committed some grave offense than it would have been to be castigated. A single favor of this kind troubled and bewildered and exhausted me more than 12 illnesses and ordeals put together. Even though I made more mistakes than I could ever atone for, it still seemed to me that when I was suffering, I deserved it. And at least it gave me the opportunity to pay a little something for my bad behavior. But to see myself receiving fresh blessings after failing to appreciate the grace I had already been given was a kind of torture to me. I think anyone who has any knowledge and love of God must feel this way. All we have to do is reflect on the ultimate good, and we can't help but notice how far we are from it. As I took stock of my feelings, I saw that I was always on the brink of falling into error. This awareness triggered tears of anger. At the same time, I knew that my desire was strong and my resolve was firm. It is a terrible thing for a soul to be alone in the midst of such danger. It seems to me that it would have been very helpful to me to have had someone to talk to about all of this. If I lacked sufficient shame before God, maybe I would have felt ashamed enough in front of another human being to adjust my behavior and avoid falling into error again. This is why I would advise anyone who practices prayer, at least in the beginning, to cultivate connection and companionship with like-minded souls. This is very important, because we can help each other make progress on the path of prayer and bring each other even greater benefits. After all, in ordinary human friendships, people seek each other out to relax and indulge in idle chatter, which may not be very good, and they find mutual sympathy and comfort in these attachments. So I don't see why we would ever discourage people who are beginning to love and serve God from getting together to discuss the trials and joys of the spiritual path. There are certainly plenty of both. If the friendship you desire to have with His Majesty is authentic, I don't think you need to worry about ego. When you notice the first egotistical stirrings, disclose them, and you will emerge victorious. I believe that when you discuss the trials and joys of the spiritual life for the sake of your friendship with God, you will benefit yourself and whomever you are sharing them with. Your own wisdom will increase, and without even knowing how you did it, you will contribute to the wisdom of your friends. If you have detected spiritual arrogance in yourself, you are likely to notice it coming up not only in these conversations about the practice of prayer, but also during any religious ritual that moves you to deep devotion in front of other people. This does not mean you should refrain from all spiritual practices for fear of being egotistical. Nothing should ever tempt you to abandon your path. I cannot overemphasize how important these friendships are, especially for souls whose virtue is not yet fully ripened, since there is no lack of either enemies or friends to incite them to do wrong. This vigilance about spiritual pride seems to me to be an invention of the spirit of evil, who finds our anxiety very valuable. The spirit of evil takes this concern and twists it so that those of us who truly love and serve God try to hide our spiritual inclinations, while less righteous souls are encouraged to proclaim their wicked ways far and wide. These days, offenses against God are so common that people not only find them easy to justify, but actually seem to revel in them. Maybe what I am writing sounds foolish. If this is the case, I would invite you to tear it up right now. But if what I have to say rings true, then I beg you to augment my simple understanding with your deeper knowledge. People are so lazy regarding the things of God that those of us who love and serve Him need to back each other up if any of us are going to make any progress on the path. It is generally considered to be a fine thing to buy into the vanities and comforts of the world, and nobody thinks twice about these indulgences. On the other hand, the minute someone gives herself to God, she has no shortage of critics. We need companions to defend us against this kind of persecution until we grow strong enough to protect ourselves and not become discouraged by suffering. Without this companionship, we find ourselves in deep difficulty. I think this must be why some holy men and women used to withdraw to the desert. There is a kind of humility in not trusting exclusively in ourselves, but in turning to others in the hope that God will help us all. Charity increases when it is shared. 1,000 blessings flower from this kind of sharing. If I had not directly experienced the benefits of this type of exchange, I would not dare advocate it. It is true that I am the weakest and most wicked of anyone ever born. But I believe that someone who humbles herself, no matter how strong she might be, and trusts another who has more experience than she in these matters has nothing to lose. I know that if the Beloved had not revealed this truth to me and provided me with access to other people who were practicing prayer, I might have continued rising and falling until I plunged into hell. Believe me, I had plenty of friends to help me fall. But when it came to rising, I found myself so completely alone. It's a wonder I did not remain stuck where I had fallen. I praise the mercy of God, for He is the one who gave me His hand. May He be blessed forever and ever. Amen.